What's up, everybody, and welcome to a brand new episode of Brewing with 50 bucks. This is the series where we take your favorite commanders, we slap on a $50 budget, and not only do we make a deck that is functional, but is able to pick you up the win. My name is Stefan. I'm coming to you from the General Warfare headquarters. I'm glad you can join us today. As you can see, the holidays are near. This is my second favorite time of the year, next to Halloween, obviously. I got my Santa hat, I got my festive sweater with the great Mike Tyson on here, and best of all, I got my nog. So I'm well prepared. As you also may know, over the past several weeks, we've been tackling commanders from each set that has been released in 2021, minus Modern Horizons 2. Last week, we ventured into the Forgotten Realms. The week prior to that, we entered the School of Mages. And the week before that, we journeyed into the 9 Realms of Kaldheim, which leaves us to our last 2 weeks of the year and the last 2 weeks of our Deck Brew series. These last 2 weeks, we're gonna be tackling the 2 commanders from Innistrad, both Midnight Hunt and Crimson Vow. So this week's venture is into Innistrad, Midnight Hunt. I've already covered Lenore Autumn Sovereign as a special preview video for when she was first spoiled, and I also covered Lind, Cheerful Tormentor, who is actually the first to adopt the new Brewing thumbnail template you see in every brew video from here on out. So this week, we're gonna tackle a commander from the actual main set. And no, just because it's Christmas doesn't mean we're gonna be making gruel, because it's too easy and werewolves are very, very underpowered. So I decided to brew the next best commander. So as we take a look at our new commander for today, Vadrik Astral Archmage. He lights up the sky with spells and trickery. What more can I say about it? So we actually have a pretty stacked video today, so let's not waste too much time and let's get into what our commander does. So, Vadrik Astral Archmage is a 1/2 for 1 blue and red legendary human wizard with the abilities if it's neither day nor night, it becomes day as Vadrik Astral Archmage enters the battlefield. Instants and sorcery spells you cast cost X less to cast, where X is Vadrik's power. And whenever day becomes night or night becomes day, put a +1/+1 counter on Vadrik. As you can tell with these abilities, Vadrik is very keen on reducing the cost of your spells and also getting bigger himself. So the entire strategy of this deck is a very funny one. We're mainly going to be focusing on making treasures to aid in casting our spells while we get Vadrik's power big and reduce our spell costs even further. And as always, we brew these decks with a budget of $50 in mind, which includes the price of the commander, which excludes the price of the basic lands, and we also offer a $5 overage compromise. We offer this compromise because this deck can be easily built for $50, but we have also add a $5 wiggle room special. So basically, that's the reason why we're offering this compromise for you. You can find the deck list in the description down below, and if I can ask of one thing for you guys, just please consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and hitting that bell icon. One small click from you goes a long way for this channel, and if you do so, thank you very, very much. So we're gonna break down this video into our different categories. We're gonna go through the standard array of categories, which includes our sorceries, our instants, our enchantments, our creatures, our lands, and our artifacts. We're gonna start with our most cumbersome of categories, which is our instants. I will say right off the bat, both our instants and our sorceries make up about roughly 50% of this deck. There's about 24 instants in this deck and 23 sorceries. So we have a very big cumbersome amount of spells as this deck is very much based around. Let's not waste time and let's get started with our very first card, Arcane Denial. Easy enough, it's a counter spell, but with this, its controller gets drawn up to 2 cards and you draw a card at the beginning of the next turn's upkeep. So with this, you're able to counter your opponent's spells and you also draw a card from it while your opponent draws 2. Communion Lava is next. With this, we're able to exile the top X cards of our library and we get to play more spells on our turn. We basically get access to not a secondary hand almost with these exiled cards, and also we get more options to use against our opponents. Fact or Fiction is next, and this is also another blue staple card, basically where you get to reveal the top 5 cards of your library. Opponents separates them into 2 piles and you choose one of the piles. And as far as I know, every blue deck runs this card. If you don't run this card, let me know in the comments, but this is, I really feel, is a really good card in any blue deck. Firemind's Foresight is next, and I decided to add this card mainly as a small tutor because you can search your library for an instant with Converted Mass 3 and then repeat it for mana value 2 and 1. So you're basically tutoring for 3 cards for the cost of 7. However, with Vadrik's ability, you can reduce that cost way down to even as little as 2 mana. Fist of Flames is next, and with this, you get to draw a card until end of turn turn, target creature gains trample and gets +1/+0 with each card you've drawn this turn. So if you're drawing a lot of cards, and especially with Vadrik, with his power being super big and giving him trample, easy enough he can go in, get in for that commander damage kill and commander damage win. Frantic Search is next. Draw 2 cards, discard 2 and untap 3 lands. Easy enough, and it's really good, especially if you can reduce this cost for 1 and float 2 mana to it. Invent is next, where you basically use this card for its invent cost. Basically, you get to search your library for an instant card and or sorcery, and you get to put them in your hand and shuffle your library. It's very good, especially if you can reduce this cost down to minimum 2. Even at 3 or 4, it's a really good cost. 6 mana is a lot to pay for Invent. But that being said, having the ability to search your library for an instant and sorcery is beyond ridiculous. Invigorated Rampage is next. So with this, we either get to give target creature +4/+0 and trample, or give 2 target creatures +2/+0 and trample till end of turn. And with this, basically, if we want to go for that big game-ending win, we could just use the first one and put it on Vadrik to give him +4/+0 and trample. Or if we want to go wide, give it +2/+0. Lunar Frenzy is next, and with this, a target creature gets +X/+0 and gains first strike and trample until end of turn. So as you can tell, trample is a very big part of our strategy in this deck. But that being said, you're also able to give Vadrik a very healthy amount of damage to your opponents at instant speed. Negate is next, very staple blue card, counter target non-creature spell. Resculpt is next. I believe I already put this in my last deck brew with Gretchen Titchwellow, but this is also a really good card to eliminate any pesky artifact or creature that your opponents control, and in return giving them a 4/4 blue and red elemental creature token. Rewind is next. Counter target spell and untap up to 4 lands. If you could reduce this up to 2 blue mana, you're basically in the driver's seat to basically net you some extra mana. Seething Song is next, where it gives you 5 red mana for 3 mana. It's still good. The reason I'm adding this is just to give you some more mana to cast more and more spells. Snap is next, where you get to pay 2 mana to return target creature to its owner's hand and untap up to 2 lands. So a majority of our instant speed interaction revolves around untapping your lands, because honestly, your lands are your most valuable resource, and the fact that you're able to untap them with certain cards is beyond ridiculous. Spell Burst is next. I decided to add this because it's a low cost counter spell, but it also has buyback 3, where you get to counter target spell with converted mana cost X, and then you can buy it back for 3. The buyback cost is not reduced from Vadrik's ability, it's mainly the casting cost that is reduced, so you can't just buy it back for 0 mana, so you will have to spend that extra 3 mana to get Spell Burst back into your hand. Spell Pierce is next, where you can target a non-creature spell unless its controller pays 2 mana. Spell Swindle is next, where you get to counter a target spell and you create X colors treasure tokens, where X is the converted mana cost of the spell. This is one of our main themed cards, where you're getting a massive amount of treasures based on countering a spell. Although it is a very expensive card in terms of price and kind of expensive in terms of mana value, it's still a really good card to add in this deck, mainly because you're reducing the cost with Vadrik's for the mana value, and the fact you're getting mana back with it is just really good. Sudden Breakthrough is next, and where you get to give target creature +2/+0 and first strike till end of turn, and you create a treasure token. So it's a 2/4. So you're basically paying effectively 1 mana to give something +2/+0 and first strike. Thirst for Knowledge is next, where you draw 3 cards and discard 2 unless you discard a land, or a basic land for that matter. So for the majority, we're running 34 lands in this deck, and a good majority of the lands that we have, especially if we're casting a lot of spells, are expendable. So drawing 3 and only discarding 1 is not a bad compromise. Unexpected Windfall is next, where you get to pitch a card, draw 2, and then create 2 treasure tokens. So you're basically rummaging for an extra card, and you basically get an extra treasure token on top of it. Unleash Fury is next, where you get to double a target creature's power until end of turn. So with Vadrik, if you're able to get in for that commander damage win and sneakily do it so, especially with you playing Unleash Fury, you're able to get that game-ending win. Unsubstantiate is next, where you get to return target spell or creature to its owner's hand. Note, it says spell, so whenever somebody's casting a spell, you can actually unsubstantiate it and return it back to their hand if they don't have the mana to play it for the next turn. Unwind is next, is the exact same thing as Rewind, but for 3 mana, you get to counter target non-creature spell and untap up to 3 lands. Correction, it's not Rewind because it's limited to non-creature spells. However, you get to untap up to 3 lands, and so you're still effectively countering a spell for 0 mana. Lastly, Volcanic Fallout is our last card of our instance, where you get to deal 2 damage to each creature and each player. This spell can't be countered, completely wipes your opponent's fields, especially if they're going wide with token strategies or anything to do with small power on the field. You can completely wipe their board with 2 damage to each creature and each player, so each player takes 2 damage as well. Next up on our list is Sorceries. As I mentioned before, we're running 23 Sorceries. This is the second part of our near 50% of our deck right here. We're gonna start off with one of our main win cons of the deck, which is Apex of Power. So the reason I'm adding Apex of Power is that it's a very, very strong card to use against your opponents. And in one game, I was able to wheel this into 4 different Apex of Powers, returning it to my hand multiple times, just valuing off the 40 mana that I made off it. So anyways, you get to exile the top 7 cards of your library and you can cast those spells from among them. Now, note, you can't cast them without paying their mana cost. You have to cast them by paying the cost, but you're getting 10 mana if you play it from your hand. So this is some very good value, especially if you're able to loop this multiple times and get some extra 10 mana each time you play it from your hand. Brass's Bounty is next. For each land you control, you create a treasure token. As I mentioned before, this entire theme revolves around getting treasure tokens. So Brass's Bounty is easy enough to get you there with extra amount of treasure tokens. Deep Analysis is next. For 4 mana, you get to draw 2 cards, and you flash it back for 2 mana, 1 in a blue, and pay 3 life. So at the cost of paying some extra life, you get to basically draw 4 cards. Epic Experiment is next, where for X, blue, and red, you get to exile the top X cards of your library. You can cast instant and sorcery spells with mana value X or less from them without paying their mana cost, and then put all the exile cards were cast in the graveyard. So, especially if you're, as I mentioned before, if you're looping Apex of Power multiple times in a turn, and you're able to get a very big Epic Experiment, imagine the amount of damage you can do to your opponents, especially giving you the ability to cast these without paying the cost, and if you have extra mana left over, you can just replay them multiple times afterwards. Expanded Anatomy is next. This is the only spell in our deck, minus our artifacts, that is colorless. With this, you get to put 2+1/+1 counters on target creature, and it gains vigilance until end of turn. So this is how we kind of jumpstart our Vadrik's spell reduction plan. With this, you put 2+1/+1 counters on Vadrik, making your spell reduction up to 3. So each one of your spells costs 3 less to cast. And vigilance is just a little nifty add-on to it. Although we really want Vadrik's power to be stupidly high so that we can cast our instants, our sorceries for as little as like 1 or 2 mana. Finale of Promise is next. This is also another one of our win cons. With this, you get to cast up to 1 target instant or sorcery from your graveyard, each with converted mana cost X or less without paying the mana cost. And if the card was cast, would be put into your graveyard, you exile it, but if X is 10, or more, you copy each one of those spells twice. You can choose new targets for the copies. So Finale of Promise basically wins you the game. Effectively, if you're doing this multiple times, especially with like Apex of Power, Brass's Bounty, and other cards, and that I'm going to be naming off in just a little bit, where you get to double the amount of like value you get, double the amount of mana you get. You're basically going to be in the driver's seat, and you're going to be winning the game, especially with the amount of mana you have, the amount you can just filter into Vadrik's. Ignite the Future is next. You get to exile the top 3 cards of your library until the end of your next turn. You may play those cards, and if the spell was cast from a graveyard, you can cast them without paying your mana cost. It has a flashback of 8 mana, but you get this down the initial cost to up to 1 mana, and with it, you basically get to exile the top 3 cards, and you get some more information, and you have some more spells you can cast with Ignite the Future as part of your side hand, I will call it for the time being. Ingenious Mastery is next, where with this you get to draw X cards, but you can pay 2 and a blue rather than pay the cost, where you draw 3 cards. If you do play this spell for this cost, rather, you could draw 3 cards, and an opponent creates 2 treasure tokens and then scries 2. Now, normally you don't want to do that, so you want to pay that extra cost. So, especially with Vadrik's, if at least his power is 2, basically Ingenious Mastery just costs 1 blue and X. And I'm pretty sure the X is reduced as well with the power. So let me know if that is actually true in the comments. But In Genius Mastery, you're able to draw as many cards as you desire. Now, Inner Fire is next. For 4 mana, you get to add 1 red mana for each card in your hand. So if you have a very stacked hand, and if you have a multitude of cards in your hand, you get to add 1 red mana for each card in your hand. It's kind of like an inverse Jeska's Will, where you're the one profiting off the amount of cards you have in your hand, instead of you're profiting off the amount of cards you have in your opponent's hand. Into the Night is next, where it becomes night. You discard any number of cards and then draw that many cards +1. So you're basically self-wheeling. With this, you could flip the day-night schedule over to night. So as long as it's day for Vadrik and you play this card, you switch it over, you give a +1/+1 counter to Vadrik for his 3rd ability, and then you get to self-wheel and draw that many cards +1. Mind's Desire is next. With this is one of our only storm cards that we have in the deck, where you get to shuffle your library, you exile the top card of your library until end of turn. You may play that card without paying its mana cost. So I don't believe we run any infinite mana combos or infinite storm count cards, any storm count combos in this deck. So with Mind's Desire, you're going to be profiting quite a bit less than you would if it was infinite storm count. That being said, having the ability to playing a spell off the top of your library without paying the mana cost is extremely good and extremely valuable to you and your plan, especially with Vadrik on the field. Mnemonic Deluge is next, where you get to exile a target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard, copy it 3 times, and you can cast the copies without paying the mana cost. You exile it at the end of turn, but imagine Mnemonic Deluge in your graveyard, and then you cast a Finale of Promise, where you get to double it. With that, you have multiple different avenues you can go down with Mnemonic Deluge as well. Even if you do this with Brass's Bounty, getting that stupid amount of mana, and that way you can pay into anything you have on the field. Mystic Retrieval is next, where you get to return a target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand, and it has flashback 2 in a red. Easy enough to get any card you want back in your hand, especially an Apex of Power that you can loop and use the secondary abilities to get use some extra mana on your side of the field. Now, Pirate's Pillage is next, where you get to rummage your deck. The additional cost to cast it, you discard a card, you draw 2 cards, and then you create 2 treasure tokens. So you're basically getting an extra card and 2 extra mana on top of it. So you're effectively paying 2 mana for rummage, basically. Pirate's Prize is next, where you get to draw 2 cards and create a treasure token. Same cost, 4 mana for both. However, with this, you don't have to rummage, you just draw the 2 cards and then you create a treasure token instead of creating 2. Reckless Endeavor is next, and with this is one of our cards from the Commander set from Forgotten Realms, where you roll 2 d12s and choose 1 result. It deals damage equal to that result to each creature, and then creates a number of treasure tokens equal to the other result. Effectively, if you want more treasures, you choose the bigger results to get the more treasures, and then you have the other result, the lower results, just deal damage to each creature. With that being said, Reckless Endeavor is a really strong card, especially if you're casting this or copying this multiple times. It's really funny, and I decided to add it in the deck because it's exactly that. It's extremely funny. Recoup is next, where you're gonna have target sorcery card in your graveyard gain flashback, and the flashback cost is equal to the mana cost of the card, with flashback 4. So any one of the sorceries that I mentioned previously, and I'm going to mention for the next little bit, will have flashback. So this means Finale of Promise has flashback, Epic Experiment has flashback, Apex of Power has flashback, Mind's Desire would have flashback. Any one of those cards would be supremely good with Recoup. Rousing Refrain is next, where you get to add 1 red mana for each card in target opponent's hand until end of turn. You don't lose the mana as steps at phase's end, and then you exile it with 3 time counters on it. So you have a suspend 3 Jeska's Will in your hand for a little bit more than Jeska's Will is actually costing. That being said, some extra mana on your side of the field to cast more spells, and for Vadrik to get stupidly big and reduce your spell costs. Seize the Spoils is next, where for 3 mana you discard a card, draw 2, and then create a treasure token. Similar to what Pirate's Pillage does, except you're paying 1 less mana to get 1 less treasure on your side of the field. Strike It Rich is next, where for 1 red mana you create a treasure token, and flashback 3. Simple enough, you're getting a treasure token. Tezzeret Gambit is next for 3 and a Phyrexian mana. With this, you can either pay it with a blue or 2 life instead of having to pay the extra cost, where you get to draw 2 cards and then proliferate. This is one of the only proliferate cards we add in this deck. So with proliferate, we can double up on the amount of +1/+1 counters we have on Vadrik. With this, his ability will trigger, getting you a +1/+1 counter, and your spells will cost 1 less to cast, which is really good, especially if you have Tezzeret Gambit only for the Phyrexian mana. You could just pay 2 life to do it and then proliferate and just have incredible value from there on. Treasure Cruise is next with this 7 mana and a blue to delve, where you get to exile as many cards from your graveyard to pay for the spell for 1, and then you just draw 3 cards. Simple enough. And last of our sorceries is Volcanic Vision, where you get to return an instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand, and it deals damage equal to that card to each creature your opponents control based on the mana value, and then you exile the card after it's cast. But if you have this and you use it on one of your bigger cards like Apex of Power, that's 10 mana dealt to each one of your opponent's creatures, which would effectively eliminate their entire board. Now let's get into our artifacts next. We're running not as, like, maybe twice as few artifacts than we are any of our instants or our sorceries. We're only running 9 artifacts in this deck, but each one of these artifacts does give us a little bit of a boost, whether it be in mana or in value. So first of all is Blackblade Reforge. Now, I know I'm adding Blackblade a second time in 2 deck brews, and this one may not be as efficient as the one in Gretchen Titchwillow. However, it's still a good boost, and you can equip it to Vadrik for 3 mana, and each one of your lands effectively gives you a +1/+1 to Vadrix and reduces the spell cost by 1. So in one way, it's not going to be as big as Gretchen Titchwillow would be. However, Vadrix would reduce the spell cost by a significant amount with Blackblade Reforge. Commander Sphere is next. This is one of the few mana rocks we're running in this deck. Basically, it's one of the staple cards I run in almost any single commander deck. Commander Sphere allows you to tap for 1 mana of your commander's color identity, and then you sacrifice it to draw a card. It's really simple and good for 3 mana. Hand of Vecna is next. I never thought I would ever put this in a deck. However, my decision has been changed since then, because at the beginning of your combat on your turn, the equipped creature or the creature you control named Vecna, which is never going to happen in this deck, gets +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the number of cards in your hand. Now, the equip is either pay 1 for each card in your hand or equip 2. I'm not sure how this stacks, so please let me know in the comments. But for each card in your hand, basically on your combat, you could have Vadrik have an extra 4 or 5 power to his name and then just swing in for the kill. I think this is a really good start, and especially if it goes to your second main phase and Vadrix is not dead, your spells cost 4 less to cast on your second main phase, where you can go ham with your entire board and your entire field and everything. Hero's Blade is next. Equipped creature gets +3/+2, and then whenever a legendary creature enters the battlefield in your control, you can have Hero's Blade attached to it. So anytime Vadrix comes on the field, Hero's Blade will attach to Vadrix, giving him +3 power, and your spells will be reduced by 4. Is it Cluestone is next? It's just a standard rock where you get to tap for either a blue or a red, and then blue and a red, tap it and sacrifice the Cluestone to draw a card. Is it Signet is next? And yes, it is a Signet. Basically, for 2 mana to cast it, 1 mana, and tap it to add blue and a red. Mind Stone is next, adding a colorless mana, and then you tap 1, tap it, and sacrifice the Mind Stone to draw a card. Runechanter's Pike is next. This is a very budget card, and I thought this was a really good card to add in this deck, where enchanted creature gets first strike and then gets +X/+0, where X is the number of instants and sorcery cards in your graveyard. Now, considering how many instants and sorceries I named just a couple of minutes ago, imagine how big Runechanter's Pike would actually get, and imagine how big Vadrix would get enchanted with the Runechanter's Pike. Your spells in general, your non-permanent spells, would cast a stupid amount less, and you could probably pay them for 1, 2, or 3 mana easily. And lastly, the Celestis. Now, we added this in Hoffrey just as a joke, but in this deck, it's actually valuable, because the Celestis actually allows you to switch the day and night schedule at any point as a sorcery speed, but it gives extra power to Vadrik. Not only that, but whenever it switches between them, you gain a life and you get to rummage, basically draw a card and then discard a card, and you also get to tap it for an extra mana, which is very valuable in this deck. Our next category is our creatures. We're running 7 creatures. Not a lot in comparison to our other builds, but considering the amount of instants and sorceries we're running, it's not completely necessary. With our first creature, Flux Channeler, whenever you cast a non-creature spell, Proliferate. Easy enough. We're running 47 spells in this deck, and then we have an extra 11 that are non-creature as well. So anytime you're casting them, you're proliferating, and each one of your +1/+1 counters will grow on Vadrix, and your spells will be reduced by that much. Harmonic Prodigy is next, and I decided to add this because of its ability, where if an ability of a shaman or another wizard we control would trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. So, especially with Flux Channeler, if you're proliferating, you're getting to put 2 +1/+1 counters on Vadrix, which means anytime it goes from day or night, you're getting 2 +1/+1 counters, and your spells are going to be reduced by a further 2. Carfell Harbinger is next for 2 mana. It's a 1/3, but it taps for a blue, and you get to spend this mana only to foretell a card from your hand or cast an instant or sorcery spell. So with this, basically I'm adding it as an extra mana dork just to cast instants and sorcery spells. It's easy enough for extra value and extra ramp. I don't expect this to go a long game, but it's good enough just for an extra mana to cast your spells. Murmuring Mystic is next, and whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you create a 1/1 blue bird illusion creature token with flying. So each one of your spells gets you an extra creature on the field, and especially ones with flying. So it gives it evasion too, so you can actually go in, especially if your opponents don't have reach or other cards with flying, you can go in for an easy kill depending on how many spells you cast that turn. Stormkill Artist gives it +1/+1 for each artifact you control, but its Magecraft ability is the key to this. Whenever you cast an instant or copy an instant or sorcery spell, you create a treasure token. Each one of your spells, instants or sorceries, gives them an extra treasure token. So that's going to give you more mana to cast your other spells too. And it's going to give Stormkill Artist an extra +1/+0, which value. Unblinking Observer is next. It's the same thing as Carfell Harbinger. Basically, instead of being a 1/3, it's a 2/1, but you tap it for blue and to pay a disturb cost or cast an instant or sorcery spell. So basically an extra blue mana to cast an instant or sorcery. Lastly, Young Pyromancer is next. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, you create a 1/1 red elemental creature token. Copy and paste from Murmuring Mystic, except for elementals in this case. Our penultimate category is our enchantments. This is not going to be a very long category. We're only running 2 enchantments. First of which is Clout of the Dominus, where you're giving Vadrik's a bunch of evasion, giving him not only +2/+2, but basically gives him Shroud and Haste. So you're giving him +1/+1 as long as he's blue and Shroud, and then +1/+1 as long as he's red and Haste. So basically you're giving Vadrix an extra +2/+2. Your spells are going to be reduced by an extra 2, and he can't be targeted by any other spell. And especially after Cloud is equipped, unfortunately you cannot equip Vadrix with anything else. So unfortunately you're going to have to rely on your +1/+1 counters there. And the second one is Wizard class. Now this is the only way we're going to have no maximum hand size in our deck, but with this +2 you get to draw 2 extra cards, and whenever you draw a card you put a +1/+1 counter on trigger creature you control. So easy enough to get to that level 3, and whenever you draw a card you're giving Vadrix a +1/+1 counter. Especially with this and the Harmonic Prodigy, you're easily going to give him +2/+2 and just keep ramping up how many +1/+1 counters he has on him. Our last category is our lands. As I mentioned before, this is the fuel to our engine, and we're running 34 lands in this deck, starting off with Emergence Zone. With this, we're adding a colorless, but for 1 and tap it, and sacrifice it, you could cast spells this turn as though they had flash. So anytime you want to cast your sorceries, you just sacrifice the Emergence Zone, and you can cast your sorceries as though they were instant speed. Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse are basically categorized in the same field, where you get to sacrifice them and search your library for a basic land and put it on the battlefield tap. As you know, if you've seen these brews before, I love running these kind of cards because it filters out the basic lands from your deck onto the field. So that way, whenever you're drawing your cards, you don't always run into a lot of basic lands. Hall of Oracles is next, another colorless mana, but 1 and tap it to add a mana. But the most important one is you tap it to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. Activate this only as a sorcery and only if you cast an instant or sorcery this turn. So easy enough, you just cast an instant and then you tap it to put a +1/+1 counter on Vadrix and reduce the cost of your spells. Myriad Landscape is next, and as I've mentioned before and multiple times, I love adding this card to any one of my decks. Although it does come into play tapped and it only taps for a colorless, it basically, for the 2 mana and sacrificing, you get to search your library for 2 basics and put it onto the battlefield tapped. You're taking a turn off to play this, but you're searching your library afterwards for 2 basic lands to get out of your library and put it onto the battlefield. Mystic Sanctuary is next, and with this, it actually enters the battlefield tapped unless you control 3 or more other islands. But when it comes into play untapped, you can put the target instant or sorcery from your graveyard on top of your library. So you play this, you get a big instant or sorcery back into your hand on the next turn, or if you're able to draw it on the next go. Opal Palace is next. You tap it for a colorless, but for 1 and tap it, you add 1 mana of any color of your commander's color identity. You spend this mana to cast your commander. It enters the battlefield with a number of additional +1/+1 counters on it equals equals the number of times it's been cast from the command zone this game. Easy enough. If Vadrik dies a multitude amount of times, they use Opal Palace's ability to get him back in the field with an additional amount of +1/+1 counters. Riptide Lab is next, and I'm surprised how cheap this card has actually become, basically allowing you to pay 1 blue and return target wizard you control to its owner's hand. And so this is a way to protect Vadrik's, even though you are losing the +1/+1 counters on him, you are protecting him from any board wipe or targeted removal. Tyrite Sanctum is next, and I've already mentioned this in my Kaldheim build for Toralf. This is a really good card, especially giving a legendary creature a +1/+1 counter, which Vadrik's is all about, but the secondary one where you sacrifice it and put an indestructible counter on him, that's valuable because that way it won't be targeted removal unless you have to sacrifice Vadrik or unless you have to exile him. In that way, as long as you have Riptide Lab, you're good as gold to make sure of that. And we're also running an additional 12 islands and 13 mountains to round off this deck list. And that's how you build a wizard who's hungry for treasure and giant spells. With our deck budget of $50, which includes the price of the commander and excludes the price of the basic lands, we come up to a deck cost of $52.55, which actually is within our budget. So with last week's video of Gretchen Titchwillow, we were very near our $5 overage compromise, which was very, very scary when I was looking at the calculation afterwards. Well, for the video, I should say. But with this one, we're actually within our budget, and especially since people can actually afford the extra $2.55 to build this deck, it's very, very easy for people to actually just pick this up, pick up the necessary cards, and add that extra $2 to it. And this is actually a very fun deck from playtesting. So actually, speaking of playtesting, let's go over some pros, some cons, and some out-of-budget recommendations for this deck. So, some of our pros and cons of this deck. So we'll go over some of our pros first. The first of which, it has insane value. As I mentioned multiple times in this deck brew, this deck has a lot of big spells, and especially in playtesting, I was able to get an Apex of Power go off 4 times in one turn, giving me 40 mana to work with. And especially so, if you're able to get off a Finale of Promise for a lot of mana, over 10 mana at least, you're going to be good as gold to win the game. Although it does rely a little bit on synergy and making sure Vadrik sticks on the field to make sure your spells cost a significant amount less. It still has a lot of value, and it has a lot of good instant speed interaction. Like I mentioned, our most cumbersome category is our instants, and as you saw before, we do have a good amount of instant speed interaction with our deck, but be it countering spells or returning spells to their hands, or just giving our Vadrik a significant boost, trample, first strike, whatever. It has instant speed interaction to where your opponents won't know what to do with, and best of all, it makes a lot of treasure, which is our main theme of the deck. We want to make a lot of treasures in this deck. We want to make sure that we have a lot of mana to cast our spells, and we want to go as wide as we can with our spell casting. So with this, I do feel we have a lot, given our current budget restriction with this, we have a lot of good ways to make our treasure tokens. Some of our cons also is that the most glaring one is it can explode a little too early. Either being that it goes off way too early and you don't know what to do with it, or basically you're just out of the game and you don't have any ways to basically filter your draws. Either way, with Vadrik's, he can go crazy. He can go crazy quite early, and after that, if you don't have anything to do, your opponents are going to be looking your way easily. On a couple of occasions, I've noticed that you can also be spinning your wheels during big turns. Like if you have an Apex of Power and you play it a few times and get it back multiple times, it could be that you don't hit too many. Like I've also ran a couple of games where I tried an epic experiment and it only gave me 1 instant out of the 7 that I was able to exile at the top of my deck. And that's just to give you an example. Like you could just be spinning your wheels and you can't really do too much besides that. And as I mentioned before, there's not much filter draw. So as like the amount of what we can do, especially with our rummage, and as much as we're drawing cards in this deck, there's not a lot we can do to filter it out. Like there's no outlets that we can just discard into, and that we can just filter it and just get other cards that we can play with. We'll go over some out of budget recommendations for this deck. So This deck is built for a $50 budget, but if you feel like building this deck and going a little bit beyond the $50, here are some cards that I can actually recommend to you to add in the deck. The first of which is Goldspan Dragon, and why wouldn't you add this card in this deck? This deck is about making treasures, and as every time Goldspan Dragon is targeted, or whenever he attacks, you create a treasure. Easy enough, so whenever you're casting, and he's also a bomb too, so you want, and with this deck, I feel like we're missing a lot of bombs. So having Goldspan Dragon in your deck, especially if you're running it, is going to be incredible to add in your deck. The next of which is Leer, Disciple of the Drowned, where your spells can't be countered. Let me say that again. Your spells cannot be countered. And each one of your instants of sorceries in your graveyard has flashback. So you can cast them a second time if you so desire. Like, it's not like easily Leer can be put in this deck and taken out for other lesser cards. But that being said, this has this deck limitation of $50 and we're running with what we can. But if you are going to be running this deck for a little bit more, I would strongly suggest you put Leer in the deck. Chandra's Ignition is next, and basically why wouldn't you add this if this is almost an instant win? Especially if you have Vadrik's at a high enough power, you can easily just play this card for 2 mana and then deal each other creature and each opponent 10 damage. And that way you could basically just wipe their field and just swing into one person and win the game from there. Our fourth card is Brewing, God of Storytelling. I added this card for a couple of reasons. One, because you're getting extra value for each one of the cards you're casting. Each spells you're casting, basically you add a red mana. And then if you use Hardnell, Horn of Bounty, you get to discard a card. And this is where I was mentioning before, it doesn't have a lot of card filter. This is your filter outlet if you decide to add Bergie in it. Discard a card, exile the top 2 cards of your library. You can play those cards this turn. Easy enough. Lastly is Zorn. I know he's like the least expensive of our out of budget recommendations and you can easily add him in. I just figured this deck was already stacked enough, but his ability where you would create 1 or more treasures, you can create additional treasure tokens, especially in a deck that's themed around treasures, is busted. And especially if you're going to be making multiple treasures each turn, that is where you are going to win the game. That's where I'm going to leave it off today, guys. If you made it this far, thank you very, very much. I truly appreciate it. And if you want to support the channel, please consider liking this video, sharing amongst your friends and your play groups, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell. One small click from you goes a tremendous way for this channel to get more exposure and to reach more people like you who like this kind of content. You can also follow me on my socials. They'll be linked in the bottom left-hand side of your screen. You can see my TikTok, my Facebook, my Instagram, and my Twitter pages, which you can also recommend video ideas through there. I would strongly recommend it through there and not the comment section of YouTube. I also post videos weekly on Fridays, and the last thing I'll tell you before I let you guys go and enjoy the holidays is that we could officially scratch off Innistrad Midnight Hunt, which means not only is this the last video of our mini brew schedule, but this is also gonna be the last video of this channel for 2021. After that video goes live, I will take a 2-week break just to rest and recharge, so I can have more content for you guys in 2022 and some fresh ideas for you guys in 2022. And tune in next week for our final brew of the year for Innistrad Crimson Vow. I have a very funny commander lined up for that video. And once again, thank you very much for watching. I truly appreciate it. If you celebrate them, happy holidays, and please stay safe. It's getting very, very weird again, and I just want to make sure everybody is super safe. And as always, cheers, everybody.